just after midnight. My hands shook so badly I dropped the keys twice before the engine caught. Rain slammed the windshield, turning Chicago into a smear of red taillights, white headlights, and black water. The wipers kept sweeping like they could erase the last 20 minutes, but Grant's voice still lived inside my chest, cold and steady, the way real danger sounds. Lily sat beside me in her raincoat, clutching her stuffed rabbit so tightly its ears bent backward. She was 6, but fear had changed her face. Children should look sleepy at midnight, not watch their mothers like witnesses. I wanted to be calm for her. Instead, I was gripping the wheel so hard my fingers hurt, trying not to cry where she could see me. My left arm throbbed every time I turned. Grant had grabbed me there when I pulled Lily behind me, and I could feel bruises rising under my sweater, dark fingerprints blooming beneath my skin. For years I had explained everything away, the slammed doors, the constant checking, the questions that sounded protective until I answered wrong. I was a therapist. I should have recognized coercion in my home. That hurt worse than bruises. I met Grant when loneliness had already hollowed me out. Ethan had been gone for 2 years, and grief had become part of the furniture of my life. I was raising Lily, building a private practice, and living on exhaustion. Grant arrived smiling in his police uniform, broad-shouldered, confident, full of certainty I mistook for safety. He opened doors. He carried groceries. He made my life feel supported. By the time I noticed that his help always came with ownership, he was inside our routines, inside our apartment, inside Lily's trust. Looking back, every kindness had a string attached. The first time he read through my phone, he framed it as concern. The first time he told me not to wear a dress, he called it protection. The first time Lily went silent when he entered a room, I told myself she was adjusting. Shame is patient that way. It dresses itself as hope and asks for one more chance. The city looked hostile now, all blurred neon and black water. Every car that slowed near us made my pulse jump. I thought about the police station, then about Grant's badge and the men who would call him first. Lily made a tiny sound beside me, not quite a sob, more like a breath that got lost on the way out. I glanced over and saw tears sitting on her lashes. Her mouth trembled, but she was trying to be brave because children study their mothers for instructions on how scared to be. I swallowed hard and told myself to keep my voice steady, even if every word was a lie. Mothers are allowed to lie when the lie buys their child one more minute of peace. Rain soaked my blouse, and I could smell Grant on my sleeve. He had stepped in front of our door when he realized I meant to leave. What stayed with me was not the shouting. It was the calmness underneath it. Something in him had gone still, cold, and practical, as if he had finally stopped pretending and started calculating. That was when I knew I could not wait for apologies, flowers, or another excuse. I drove past the station anyway. I hated myself for that. It felt stupid. And then I looked at Lily and understood that pride was a luxury I could not afford when Lily needed something stronger than pride. I needed somewhere bright, public, and expensive, somewhere men like Grant might hesitate before making a scene. Somewhere cameras worked. Somewhere power sat at tables in tailored suits and polished watches. Somewhere that might look at a bruised woman and a frightened child and decide helping us was easier than looking away. That was how I turned toward River North. Luz Verde appeared through the rain like something imagined by a desperate woman. Warm gold light spilled through tall windows onto the wet street. Valets moved beneath the covered entrance. Sleek cars lined the curb. The place looked almost untouchable. For the first time since I had grabbed Lily and run, I felt a thin, dangerous thread of hope. I pulled to the curb and sat there for one beat, listening to rain drum over the roof while my heart knocked against my ribs. Then I unbuckled Lily and lifted her into my arms. She came without protest, small and warm and shaking. a doorman hurried toward us with an umbrella. Up close, the restaurant was brighter. All glass, stone, candlelight, and money. Through windows, I could see people drinking wine, untouched by night that had split mine open wide. For 1 second, I turned around. Shame rose fast and hot. Wet hair, smudged mascara, bruised arm, a child clinging to my neck. I looked like trouble, and trouble never belongs in rooms like that. Then Lily lifted her head from my shoulder, and I felt how her heart was beating against me. That ended the argument inside me. I stepped through the entrance, and air wrapped around us thick with garlic, perfume, and candle wax. My eyes adjusted, and Lily twisted free, hit the floor, and ran toward the back as if she knew who could save us inside. By the time I realized Lily was no longer in my arms, she was already halfway across the dining room, her small shoes slipping on polished stone as she ran toward the back corner of Luz Verde. Panic hit me so hard it turned everything sharp. Candlelight, crystal, soft piano, the rich smell of butter, wine, and expensive cologne. My wet skirt clung to my legs. Water dripped from my hair onto the floor. Every head that turned toward us felt like judgment, and for one humiliating second all I could think was that I had brought my disaster into a room built for people who had never known one. Lily reached a table set apart from the others, not by distance, but by gravity. The man sitting there was alone, a glass of red wine untouched beside one hand, his dark suit fitting him with the kind of precision that said money had never been a question. But it was not the suit that made the space around him feel different. It was the stillness. Everyone else in that room moved, laughed, gestured, performed. He didn't. He simply occupied space as if the whole restaurant had adjusted itself around him without being asked. I rushed after Lily, heat crawling up my neck despite the cold rain still clinging to me. I was painfully aware of everything about myself. My damp hair, my bruised arm, my ruined makeup, the fact that I looked exactly like the kind of woman people pitied in private and avoided in public. Lily, in her frightened honesty, had none of that shame. She went straight to him like children sometimes go straight to the truth. I could hear the tremble in her breathing as she tried to explain the danger in the simplest words possible, the way scared children do when they no longer believe adults are listening fast enough. Then the man looked up. I have spent years reading body language for a living. Defensive posture, dissociation, hypervigilance, manipulation dressed as charm. But nothing about this man fit into any easy category. His face barely changed, yet his attention sharpened so completely it felt physical. His eyes moved first to Lily, then to me, and in that brief sweep I had the strange, chilling sense of being assessed and understood at once. Not judged, measured. Behind the calm was something controlled and dangerous, but not chaotic, not drunk, not impulsive. Trained, I thought immediately. This was not a man who performed power. This was a man who had it. I bent to grab Lily, apologizing without really forming the words, trying to pull her back before I made the scene even worse. That was when I saw movement through the glass doors behind us. A familiar shape in the rain, broad shoulders, dark jacket, Grant. Everything inside me seized. He was standing just outside the entrance under the wash of the streetlights, water dripping from his hair, his face pale with fury and certainty. He had found us faster than I thought he would. Maybe he had followed the car. Maybe he knew me well enough to predict desperation. My mother brain went wild at once. Grab Lily, run, hide, scream. But my body would not move. I could only stare at him through the glass. And that old, terrible knowledge settled over me again. Grant never looked angrier than when he felt entitled. The man at the table followed my line of sight. His expression did not break. He simply reached into his jacket, took out his phone, and made one call. No raised voice, no dramatic threats, no attempt to reassure me with empty words. He spoke in a tone so low I barely heard it, but the effect was immediate. That was the part that shocked me most. No theater, just action. A decision made and set into motion before most people in the room even realized anything was wrong. A few minutes earlier, I would have thought help looked like sirens. Instead, it arrived in silence. Black SUVs slid to the curb outside as if they had been waiting around the block for permission to breathe. Doors opened, and men in dark coats stepped out with the same contained energy as the man behind me. Not sloppy muscle, not swagger, precision. They spread toward Grant with the kind of spacing that told me this was practiced. One moved to block the sidewalk. One stayed near the cars. Another approached Grant directly, calm as weather. Through the glass, I watched Grant straighten at first, trying to reclaim the authority his badge always gave him. Then I watched his posture change. His shoulders tightened. His head turned too quickly. For the first time that night, he looked unsure. Beside me, Lily had gone quiet. She was staring up at the stranger at the table with the kind of trust children give only when something deep in them feels safe. I should have been terrified of that. Instead, relief hit me so hard my knees almost gave out. It made no sense. This man should have frightened me more than Grant did. He was clearly powerful, clearly connected, clearly used to giving orders that were obeyed. But Grant's power had always felt personal and hungry. This felt cold, structured, almost surgical. I hated that I knew the difference. I hated even more that my body relaxed around it. The stranger rose then, tall enough that the room seemed to shift again around him. Up close, he looked even less like a fantasy, and more like a problem in an expensive suit. Strong hands, steady eyes, a face too composed for ordinary life. He looked at my bruised arm once, and then at the door where Grant was being contained outside, and I understood with a sick twist of awe that he already knew more than he should. Not just that Grant was dangerous, who he was, what he was, why he had come after us. And standing there in wet clothes with my daughter pressed to my side, I realized the worst and safest thing at the same time. Whatever happened next, I was already in his world. Not long after we left Luz Verde, the rain seemed louder inside the black car than it had outside. Maybe it was because no one in the car tried to fill the silence. A driver in a dark coat took the wheel. The man from the corner table sat across from me, composed as ever, while Lily curled into my side with her rabbit under her chin. My whole body shook with the crash after adrenaline. I could still see Grant outside the restaurant, his face changing when real power stepped toward him. Lily lasted less than 5 minutes before fear and exhaustion took her under. She fell asleep against me so suddenly it hurt, her damp curls sticking to my sleeve, one tiny fist still wrapped in the rabbit's ear. I pressed my lips to her head and tried not to fall apart. Relief felt humiliating. I had spent so long telling myself I did not need saving that being rescued felt almost as painful as being hunted. I hated how much I needed this stranger's car, his men, his impossible certainty. When he finally spoke, it was only to give me his name, and that landed harder than anything else had that night. Damien Calloway. I knew the surname at once. Everyone in Chicago who pretended not to follow power still knew it. Calloway Properties, Calloway Restaurants, Calloway donations to museums and hospitals, Calloway whispers tied to things people lowered their voices to discuss. I had read enough headlines to understand the shape of his reputation without ever wanting details. Wealth on the surface, fear underneath. The kind of man decent people avoided until desperation pushed them into his orbit. I should have asked him to stop the car and let me out somewhere anonymous. Instead, I sat there listening to the tires hiss over wet streets while the city thinned around us. Damien did not crowd me with questions. He did not offer false comfort either. That restraint made him harder to read and stranger to trust. A theatrical man would have frightened me less. I knew how to survive performance, but he kept his hands still, his voice low, and his attention fixed like a locked door. Whatever he was disciplined. Close to 1 a.m., iron gates opened ahead of us, and the car turned into a long, tree-lined drive in Winnetka. The estate rose out of the dark in warm stone and tall windows, too large to feel real, and too quiet to feel harmless. Rain tapped against the glass as manicured hedges, bare winter branches, and old lantern lights slipped past. I had driven by houses like that before, and imagined certainty lived inside them. From the back seat, holding my sleeping daughter, I understood something else. Beautiful places can still become cages. A man was waiting under the covered entrance before the car fully stopped. Silver at his temples, dark overcoat, posture too elegant for hired security and too alert for ordinary staff. Damien called him Miles Russo, and the name settled into place as neatly as everything else around him seemed to. Miles opened my door with formal politeness, but his eyes missed nothing. Not Lily's wet shoe, not my bruised arm, not the way I hesitated before stepping out. There was something almost grandfatherly in his face, if you ignored the fact that he looked capable of arranging disappearances before breakfast. I reached for Lily automatically, but Damien was already there, lifting her from the seat with a care that almost undid me. He moved as if he knew exactly how much weight a sleeping child became, supporting her head, keeping the rabbit tucked against her chest. Lily did not wake. She merely settled deeper against him, trusting him with the boneless surrender children reserve for people who feel safe. Gratitude rose first, then suspicion, then something harder to admit. It hurt that my daughter relaxed more easily in a stranger's arms than she had in Grant's for months. Inside, the house was all quiet luxury. Marble floors, soft lamps, our art that probably cost more than my practice had earned in its best year. Miles led us upstairs without wasting words, and I kept thinking that everyone here seemed to run on the same fuel. Efficiency, discretion, obedience. The guest suite he opened looked larger than my apartment. Damien laid Lily on the bed and stepped back so I could take over, and that small courtesy calmed me more than it should have. Then he said, in that steady voice, that we would stay here as long as it took. As long as it took. Not tonight. Not until morning. Not until we were safe. The words should have comforted me. Instead, they opened fear inside my chest. I had escaped one man who managed my life one decision at a time. Now I stood in lamplight and silence, wondering whether safety came with ownership. Damien looked toward the window, and I understood Grant was only the beginning. I finally asked myself whether this was sanctuary or something else entirely. The next morning, I woke in a bed too soft for panic, and a room too quiet for the kind of night we had survived. Sunlight spilled across cream walls and polished floors, and for a few confused seconds I forgot where I was. Then Lily's gasp floated from the window, bright and breathless, and memory came rushing back with the speed of cold water. She stood in borrowed pajamas with her palms pressed to the glass, staring down at clipped hedges, a stone fountain, and gardens still jeweled with rain. The estate looked softer in daylight, almost storybook, and that scared me in a new way. Dangerous places were easier to resist when they looked dangerous. This place looked like peace. I joined Lily at the window and felt cautious relief move through me, followed immediately by the old warning that comfort could still come with locks. A soft knock came at the door before I could decide whether to trust the light. Damien stepped in carrying a breakfast tray himself, and that alone unsettled me. He had traded the midnight suit for a charcoal sweater and dark jeans, and somehow the casual clothes made him more intimidating, not less. Men like him were easier to fear when they looked polished. Looking ordinary made him feel real. The tray held heart-shaped pancakes, sliced strawberries, butter in a white dish, and a mug of cocoa crowned with a cloud of cream. Every detail was aimed at Lily. She noticed it instantly. Her whole face lit up, and she turned toward him without hesitation. All bruised nerves and leftover fear briefly replaced by wonder. I watched him set the tray down with surprising care, making room for her small hands before he did anything else. I kept waiting for the performance to crack, for the gesture to reveal itself as manipulation, but nothing in him reached for applause. He knelt to Lily's level, listened with full attention when she admired the shape of the pancakes, and let her delight fill the room without trying to own it. That tenderness confused me more than his men had. Chicago had taught me plenty about dangerous men. It had not prepared me for one who remembered a child deserved whimsy after terror. Later that morning, he found a chess set near the sitting room windows and showed Lily the pieces as if he were introducing her to a cast of characters. The knights became brave messengers. The bishops became careful travelers. The rooks were stubborn towers that held the corners. When he lifted the queen, something in his voice changed. He treated her like the center of the board, not decoration, not backup, but power. Lily absorbed every word. So did I. I could feel the lesson landing in places beyond the game. Lily saw a beautiful story. I saw a map. Protect what matters. Control the board before chaos does. Never confuse softness with weakness. Damien handled each piece with the same patience he had used carrying her upstairs the night before. And I hated how quickly my body was learning the difference between being controlled and being cared for. That fragile warmth lasted until he told me, with the same quiet efficiency, that my clinic had already been contacted and that I was on emergency leave. Then came the second blow. Lily had been placed at St. Bridget Academy, her tuition handled, her schedule secured, protection arranged so discreetly she would never notice. My gratitude flashed first, hot and humiliating. My anger came right behind it. He had moved pieces on my life while I was still catching my breath. I knew why he had done it. Grant knew my office. He knew Lily's old routines, our parking spots, the routes we used because tired people repeat what is familiar. Damien was not wrong. That was what made it worse. Survival kept demanding that I accept help from men who decided first and explained later. I felt guilty for resenting him while standing inside a house that had kept us alive for one whole night. I felt guilty for needing him at all. By later that afternoon, the sweetness of cocoa and strawberries had faded, and the house felt watchful again. Damien stood by the window as if he were listening to weather I could not hear. When I asked myself why Grant would keep coming after us with that much certainty, I finally understood that Damien's protection was not charity and not impulse. It was preparation. He knew the shape of the storm before I did. When he turned back toward me, the room seemed to tighten. Grant, he made me understand, was not driven by rage alone. There was money behind his desperation. There was leverage. There was debt coming due soon. Later that afternoon, the house still smelled faintly of coffee and strawberries, but whatever softness the morning had offered was gone. Damien stood near the window with one hand in his pocket, and watching the grounds the way some men watch stock tickers or weather maps. I understood then that he had not been building toward comfort. He had been building toward truth, and truth, in my life, had never arrived gently. He told me Grant owed money. Not a vague amount, not the kind of debt people joke about after a bad weekend in Vegas, but $200,000 to men who did not send reminders or offer second chances. The number landed in my body before it landed in my mind. I remember staring at him, waiting for the rest of the sentence to become less impossible. It never did. Grant had gotten tangled with a network tied to cartel routes moving through parts of the city Damien's people watched closely. Grant had lost something that was not his to lose. promised something he could not deliver. Oh, and now desperation was eating through whatever conscience he had left. I wanted to interrupt, to say he had to be wrong, that Grant was cruel and controlling and dirty in ways I had spent too long excusing, but not this. Not organized, not calculated at that level. But even as I tried to resist it, old memories began rearranging themselves. The hidden cash I once found in a winter boot. The nights he came home electric and mean, then weirdly generous the next morning. The phone calls he took on the balcony with his voice dropped low. The way he always seemed more offended by inconvenience than by guilt. None of it had made sense at the time. All of it made a terrible kind of sense now. When Damien said Grant had planned to use Lily and me as collateral, the room lost its edges. He did not say the word dramatically. That almost made it worse. He said it the way a surgeon might name an injury, clean and exact. Collateral. A mother and a child turned into leverage. Time bought with our bodies, our names, our disappearance. He did not give me details, and he did not need to. Horror is efficient. My mind supplied enough all on its own. I saw school pickup lines, bedtime stories, grocery lists, all the ordinary little pieces of our life suddenly relabeled with a price tag, not just threatened, valued, packaged, delivered. Nausea hit so fast I had to sit down. My hands were cold. My face was hot. Shame burned in places rage could not reach. I had brought Grant into our home. I had let Lily hug him. I had mistaken possession for stability and authority for safety. And now the cost of that mistake stood in front of me like a number written in ink. $200,000. That was what stood between my daughter and whatever came next in the world Grant had opened the door to. Damien did not touch me at first. He gave me space, a glass of water, silence. That restraint steadied me more than comfort would have. He explained how he knew what he knew, and because I had already learned he was not a man who guessed, I believed him even when I did not want to. The people around him watched money, roots, loyalties, and sudden changes in pattern. They noticed when small men borrowed from large monsters. They noticed when a police officer's spending outran his salary, when cash appeared in the wrong places, when panic made someone careless. Grant had been careless. Desperate men always are. Damien's people had verified the debt, the pressure, and the fact that Grant had started looking for a way to trade access for time. That word, access, nearly broke me. Access to my apartment, access to my schedule, access to Lily's school forms, my work address, the things women fill out without thinking because life demands paperwork before it offers safety. Grant had not needed to break into our lives. I had handed him the map myself. And still, even with my stomach turning and my pulse beating in my throat, another question rose up with bitter clarity. What did Damien want from me? Men with that kind of reach did not rescue strangers for free. I knew enough about power to know it always collected. I remember looking at him and hating that I had to ask the question even inside my own head. What was the price of this house, these guards, this impossible shelter? What would he take later, once gratitude had softened me and fear had made me dependent? His answer came less from words than from the way he held the room. He did not step closer to crowd me. He did not bargain. He did not use my fear to open any door except the one marked safety. The boundary he set felt severe. Men who threatened women and children did not get to keep reaching for them. Under his protection, Lily and I were not negotiable. It was not framed as generosity. It was framed as law. For the first time that day, my breathing slowed. But Damien's gaze told me debt was only the first layer. When he finally said Ethan's name, the floor shifted all over again. 2 weeks later, routine had started doing what panic could not. It gave shape to the hours. Lily woke early, buttoned her St. Bridget uniform, Anne let Damien's driver take her to school as if this strange life had always been waiting for her. The protection around her was quiet enough that she never asked about it. After breakfast, I practiced my grounding exercise in the library. 5 things I could see, 4 I could touch, 3 I could hear. It felt strange turning my professional tools on myself, but it helped. I kept a notebook on the bedside table. Not case notes, just proof that the days were moving forward. Lily liked her teacher. Lily slept through the night. Damien knocked before entering. Miles appeared with tea right before panic could crest. By bedtime, Lily and I had rebuilt a little rhythm. Bath. Story. Rabbit tucked under her arm. Window checked twice because trauma repeats even when safety is real. And the estate had begun to feel less like a stage set, and more like a place a body could survive in. That afternoon, the illusion shattered. Miles appeared at the library door, polished as ever, but something in his face had tightened. Not fear. Urgency. He said Damien needed me in the study, and the book in my lap suddenly felt ridiculous. By the time I crossed the hall, I knew whatever waited inside that room would end the fragile peace I had been building one breath at a time. Damien stood behind his desk with one hand braced against the wood. Photographs were spread before him in a neat row, and the order made the content worse. My apartment. Not the apartment I had fled, but a place turned inside out. Couch cushions slashed open, drawers hanging from tracks, closets emptied onto the floor. Lily's crayons ground into the rug beneath a tipped toy box. One living room wall carried a message painted in wet red strokes, not meant to inform so much as terrify. It was violation staged for an audience of one. I sat before my knees gave up. The room smelled of leather and coffee, but all I could think about was the ordinary life flattened inside those photographs. Grant had not merely searched for us. He had staged fury where Lily slept. I touched one picture with 2 fingers as if proof required texture. My body understood before my mind did. This was not random destruction. This was a message. Come back. React. Make a mistake. Damien confirmed it in the same calm tone he used for everything difficult. Grant wanted the apartment disturbed in exactly the way I would hear about. He wanted me emotional enough to return for winter coats, school papers, medication, anything a mother might think was still recoverable. Abuse never really ends when you leave. It just changes tactics. Hearing that logic aloud made me sick. Grant knew me well enough to bait my responsibility. Then Damien told me the photographs had reached him so quickly because he had men watching the apartment from the first night Lily and I came to Winnetka. That confession split me in 2. Relief hit first. Someone had taken the threat seriously before I fully understood it myself. But the second feeling rose just as fast. I had been under surveillance too. My old building, my doorway, the remains of my private life had been folded into Damien's system without my knowledge. Safety in his world came with observation. Protection came with reach. And I looked at him and saw both truths at once. The man who had kept Grant from dragging us back, and the man who could quietly place my life under glass. I was angry with him for deciding that without me. I was grateful he had. Both feelings sat in me at the same time, heavy and honest. Damien did not try to soften them. He let the truth stand there between us. And maybe that was its own kind of respect. When I forced myself to look again, the fear changed shape. My mattress had been cut open for cash I never had. Lily's things had been thrown like trash. The red message on my wall had dried into certainty. Grant was escalating because he was losing control, and losing control was the one thing he had never survived gracefully. Damien told me this was only one layer of what his people had uncovered. The file on Grant went deeper than a bad marriage, deeper than rage, deeper even than the debt. There were motives buried in our past that grief had kept me from examining. When he said Ethan's name, the room changed. For 4 years I had lived inside a story about bad luck and widowhood. Suddenly I knew it might not be true. I sat there with one hand pressed to my stomach, the other curled against the chair arm, and felt the ground of my life tilt. Damien had more to tell me. Something about Ethan. Something that would break the past open wide. When Damien said Ethan's name, my body reacted before my mind did. My hands went cold. The study seemed to narrow, the air thinning until even breathing felt like work. For 4 years I had carried widowhood like a stone in my chest, heavy but settled. Grief had shape. It had rules. It was terrible, but it made sense. An accident. Bad weather. Bad timing. A random cruelty the world never explained. I could survive that story because it hurt in a familiar way. The moment Damien looked at me with that grave, steady expression, I understood he knew more. Damien did not rush the truth. He laid it down in pieces, careful enough that I could still hear each one when my pulse started hammering. Ethan had discovered irregular money moving around Grant long before I did. He had seen transfers that did not match a police salary, late-night meetings that never matched the excuses, and a fear in Grant that honest men did not wear. Ethan had gathered enough to think about reporting it. That was the point, Damien said in a quiet way, where my husband stopped being inconvenient and started becoming dangerous to Grant himself. I shook my head before the rest arrived, as if refusal could still change the facts. Damien never gave me a lurid version. He stayed with evidence, with broad shapes, with the cold logic of motive. Ethan's crash had inconsistencies, timing that shifted under scrutiny, damage patterns that never sat right with investigators who bothered to look closely. A sequence of events suggesting interference, not chance. No single detail shouted alone, but together they formed a line I could not unsee. Ethan had not died by chance. Someone had turned his death into a solution Grant believed would protect him. The memories came back wrong first, then true. Ethan pacing the kitchen after Lily was asleep, checking the lock twice, staring through the blinds as if he had heard footsteps no one else could hear. Ethan asking questions about Grant's overtime, his friends, his cash, and me brushing it off because I was tired, and because suspicion felt ugly inside a home. Ethan insisting that Grant should not babysit Lily, and me hearing it as tension between men instead of terror. I had spent years sanding those last weeks into something manageable. Now every splinter showed. Every argument suddenly mattered. Grief hit after shock, and it hit without dignity. I folded in the chair, one hand over my mouth, the other clutching the edge of Damien's desk as if wood could keep me upright. Ethan had kissed Lily goodnight on the evening of his life. He had asked me if I had locked the back door. He had stood in our kitchen trying to warn me, and I had answered with patience instead of alarm. The pain of losing him returned at full force, but now it carried a blade. He had died afraid, and I had not understood why. Then fury came, hot enough to burn through tears. I blamed Grant first, because he deserved every ounce of it. But anger has a cruel habit of doubling back. How had I missed it? How had I let a man like that stand close enough to my child, to my marriage, to the soft middle of our life? The worst realization was not that Grant entered after tragedy. It was that he had helped shape the tragedy itself. He had not arrived to comfort a widow and child. He had walked into damage he had made and called himself rescue. I do not remember standing, only Damien in front of me, close enough to steady me without trapping me. That was what I noticed then. He never took more space than my fear could bear. His hand settled at my elbow, then my shoulder, firm and careful, I asking through restraint rather than force. I leaned because I could not stay upright alone, and he let me do that without turning my collapse into something intimate or owed. Somewhere upstairs, Lily laughed at something of staff had said, and that sound sliced through me. She was safe. Ethan had wanted that. He made me sit again and let the worst of it pass before he said anything that sounded like comfort. What reached me was simpler. None of this had been mine to detect with perfect timing. Grant had lied for years. He had built a mask from authority, patience, and proximity. Predators survive by studying what people want to believe. I wanted peace. I wanted help. I wanted Lily to grow up with structure after loss. Damien refused to let me drown in blame. That steadiness kept me whole when every other part of me was coming apart fast. My phone rang before I could gather the pieces of myself into anything useful. The screen showed St. Bridget Academy, and dread arrived so fast it felt rehearsed. My body knew before my mind did that truth had not finished with me yet. I answered with Damien still near enough for me to feel the heat of his presence, and I heard the careful urgency in a woman's voice from the school office. There had been an incident involving Lily. The words were calm, professional, precise, and somehow that made them worse. Breathing left me the second I heard her. That Tuesday afternoon, dread hit before meaning did. The second I saw St. Bridget on my phone screen, my body knew something was wrong. My hand went numb. My mouth dried out. By the time the principal's careful, measured tone reached the part that mattered, the room had already tilted. There had been an attempted abduction during recess. Lily was safe. The words existed together, but my mind could not hold them in the same place. Safe should have canceled attempted. It didn't. It only made the terror sharper. I remember standing too fast and hearing the chair scrape across Damien's floor, as if the sound belonged to someone else. 4 years of grief had just cracked open in front of me, and now my daughter's name was being pulled into the same darkness. The principal explained that school protocols had worked exactly as designed. 2 men had approached the edge of the playground. They never reached Lily. Staff moved. Security moved faster. Lily was frightened, crying, but untouched. I kept nodding at facts my body refused to trust. Damien took the phone from my shaking hand only after I had heard enough to know this was real. He listened without interrupting, and whatever the principal said next seemed to erase the last trace of warmth from his face. I had seen him calm. I had seen him guarded. This was colder than both. Not panic. Not rage thrown around for effect. Something focused and lethal settled over him so completely that even Miles, appearing at the study door seconds later, seemed to brace before speaking. We left for the school within minutes, though I barely remember the drive. Chicago blurred past in wet gray streaks while my mind kept producing the same image over and over. Lily on blacktop, Lily running, Lily reaching for me and not finding me there. Ethan's face kept flashing through it too, because once your past is rewritten, every new danger starts wearing old grief. By the time we reached St. Bridget, I was breathing in broken pieces. One hand pressed so hard against my ribs, it felt like I might hold my heart in place by force alone. Lily came through the side entrance wrapped in a school blanket and held against one of Damien's men, as if her whole little body had forgotten how to stand on its own. The second she saw me, she reached. The second she saw Damien, she broke. Her sobs turned deeper, less shocked and more relieved, and she pushed toward him with both arms open. When he took her, she buried her face in his neck and clung to him so tightly that her knuckles whitened against his sweater. Then she called him Papa D. I should have felt threatened by that. Instead, something warm and aching opened inside me right beside the terror, while Lily was shaking too hard to speak clearly, but I understood enough from the fragments she got out. Recess. A man near the fence. Another near the gate. A hand reaching where it never should have. Then adults moving fast. Damien held her with a care that made the whole room go still around him. He did not soothe her with big promises. He grounded her with presence, and somehow that worked better. Later that night, the estate felt different. Not safer, sharper. Phones buzzed in distant rooms. Miles moved through the house with a calm that only made the urgency more obvious. Damien's men came and went without wasted motion. I caught pieces from the way they looked at him, the maps opened on tables, the clipped updates that ended the second I entered. Grant was no longer just hunting us. Pressure was building behind him. Damien finally made me understand the next 24 hours would decide whether this stayed a chase or became open war brought straight to his gates. When Damien said he was moving Lily and me to a safe house before morning, I felt the old panic rise for a completely different reason. I was tired of being transferred like luggage between fear and safety, between one man's decisions and another man's protection. I knew he was right. I knew this house might become a target before dawn. But something in me had shifted the moment I heard Lily call him Papa D. We were not just hiding anymore. We were becoming the reason he was preparing for war, and I could not keep pretending that made me passive. I told myself with a steadiness I did not yet feel that I would not disappear again. Not into another address. Not into silence. And not into the background of my life while men decided the shape of my survival. Damien looked at me, and I could feel his refusal gathering before he ever spoke. But I had crossed something inside myself. Fear was there. So was grief. So was wanting to run. None of it changed the truth. Before dawn, he would leave this house to end what Grant had started, and I was done pretending I was cargo. Sometime after midnight, the estate stopped feeling like a house and started feeling like a held breath. Men moved through the halls in quiet shoes. Doors opened, closed, locked, opened again. Miles spoke into his phone in a low voice near the stairs, and every time I saw another overnight bag appear, I understood the plan more clearly. Lily and I were being moved before dawn. Protected, yes. Also transferred. I shifted like fragile cargo from one point to another, while other people decided what danger meant. I stood outside her room and knew I could not shrink again that night. I found Damien in his study with his jacket off, sleeves pushed back, and a map spread across the desk beside two glowing phones. He looked up once, took in my face, and knew immediately why I was there. I did not let him send me away. I laid the truth out in the plainest shape I had ever used with another human being. Grant owed $200,000. Ethan was dead because he learned too much. Lily had almost been taken from school in broad daylight. The estate was next. I told Damien hiding me now meant control all over again. He resisted first. I could see it in the way his jaw set and his shoulders turned slightly, as if his body wanted to block the door even before his mind finished deciding. His instinct was to shield, to carry, to move me somewhere locked down and untouchable. Mine had become the opposite. I told him I had spent too many years surviving by shrinking, softening, apologizing, adjusting, explaining. That strategy had buried Ethan, trapped Lily in fear, and made Grant bold. Not with Lily upstairs, not after everything's stolen from us. I stopped confusing silence with safety that night. Damien finally let me in far enough to understand the shape of what was coming. Before dawn, he planned to push Grant into revealing who was with him, where he was hiding, and which line connected him back to the men pressing for payment. Damien did not describe violence. He described pressure, timing, and the need to close every exit at once. He wanted the next move made on his terms, not Grant's. He wanted the leverage severed so completely that no one could use Lily or me as currency again. I realized strategy could sound calm and end lives. What he did not have was Grant, the way I had known him in kitchens, parking lots, and sleepless 3 a.m. arguments. Panic made Grant sloppy in patterns, not random explosions. He hid cash in places he thought were clever, because no one respected old habits. He reused things when he was stressed. The memory came to me at once. A storage unit near a motel outside the city, rented under the name of a cousin he mentioning when he lied. He used it after fights and after calls he hid from me. I told Damien exactly what I remembered. The shift in the room was immediate. Miles was called in. A map was marked. One of the phones on Damien's desk began moving faster through hands and messages. Nobody treated my memory like a desperate guess. They treated it like a missing piece. That changed something in me before it changed anything on the ground. Damien looked at me differently then. Not softer, not possessive, but precise in a new way, as if he had finally recalculated my place in the equation. I was still someone he meant to protect. I was no longer the reason danger had arrived. By the time the house clock pushed toward 4, Lily was asleep again with her rabbit under her chin, unaware that every light burning downstairs meant the night was narrowing toward decision. I stood in the study doorway while Damien buttoned his cuff and shrugged into a dark coat. The silence between us was different now. Not cautious, charged. He told me, on without saying it plainly, that he would end this before sunrise if he could. I answered without words at first, stepping closer, stopping him with a hand on his chest, trusting it more than my breath that night. I did not ask for promises he could not keep. I asked for the only one that mattered to me now, that if he came back, nothing between us would return to what it had been before this night. Fear had stripped too much away for me to pretend indifference any longer. Something passed across his face then, brief and unguarded, the first sign that my certainty had reached him somewhere private. His hand covered mine. Not ownership, not rescue, recognition. In that quiet exchange, I chose the version of myself who would stop apologizing for needing all 3 things. Before dawn, Damien left with Miles and 3 men whose faces had the same disciplined blankness I had come to associate with competence. The front doors closed softly behind them, and the estate fell into a silence that felt heavier than shouting. I stayed beside Lily's bed and listened to the old house settle around us, knowing I had helped set something irreversible into motion. I was no longer asking whether violence was coming. I knew it was. The only questions by sunrise were cost, change, and whether he would come back to Lily, to me, to us all again. After Damien left before dawn, the estate seemed to fold inward around the silence he left behind. Every hallway felt longer. Every clock sounded crueler. I stayed beside Lily until morning light reached the curtains, he listening to her breathing and wondering what kind of woman I had become in a single night. I had not stayed passive. I had given them something useful. I had helped set a final move into motion. The waiting felt different because of that. It was no longer helplessness. It was responsibility. Lily woke asking for cereal and cartoons, and I gave her both with a voice so steady it frightened me. Trauma teaches you that children still need breakfast while worlds collapse. Miles checked in twice without lingering. Staff moved quietly. Phones rang behind closed doors. Outside, the grounds looked untouched. All winter grass and stone paths, as if violence belonged only to other zip codes. By noon, I had folded and unfolded the same sweater 3 times. By evening, the house itself seemed to be waiting with me. Close to midnight, our headlights crossed the front windows. I was already in the foyer before the door opened. Damien stepped inside, looking less like a victor than a man who had walked all the way through something dark and left part of himself there. His coat was damp and wrinkled. His knuckles were scraped. A line of exhaustion had settled around his mouth. But he was standing. He was breathing. That was enough to make my knees weak. He did not offer a story. He did not need to. The way he looked at me told me the ending before his quiet confirmation reached me. It was over. Grant would never threaten Lily again. Neither would the men who had decided we could be turned into leverage. I understood then that love and terror sometimes ask the same question. What are you willing to live with after this? I also understood, with a clarity that almost shamed me, that my first feeling was relief. Not horror, not moral outrage. Relief. Then came guilt for that relief, quick and sharp and useless. I had spent years training myself to be the kind of woman who believed in process, treatment, repair, lawful endings. But Grant had murdered Ethan. He had built his place in our lives on that murder. He had looked at my daughter and seen a bargaining chip. Whatever happened before Damien walked through those doors tonight, Grant had forfeited any claim on my sympathy long ago. Damien only gave me the broadest shape of the truth. Grant had talked too much at the end. Desperate men often did. He had bragged, justified, confessed the way cruel people sometimes do when they believe fear makes them untouchable. He had made himself impossible to save. I did not ask what came after that, and I knew enough about Damien's world to understand that details could become their own kind of burden. Silence, in that moment, was not denial. It was consent to survive what survival had cost. The next morning, the news did what the news always does. It took chaos and filed it into a shape the public could consume over coffee. Grant Huxley was described as a suspended officer under quiet internal review, now tied to broader criminal activity and dead in what reporters called gang-related fallout. The phrasing was neat. The photographs were old. His smile looked official, respectable, almost gentle. I stared at the screen and thought about how many monsters are helped by paperwork, by uniforms, by the human need to believe evil should announce itself more clearly than it ever does. 1 month later, Lily slept through the night without crying out. The bruises on my arm had turned yellow, then vanished. I had returned to breathing in full sentences. Damien moved with the same control, but something gentler lived under it now when he looked at Lily, and when he looked at me. We had survived the danger. That was no small thing. But survival was no longer the only question before me. I loved him, or something close enough that lying about it felt childish. Lily had given him a place in her heart. The fear beyond the gates was gone. What remained was harder and quieter. Could I build a future with a man whose promises had protected us, if the world that shaped him ran on blood and silence? That was the conversation waiting for us now. 1 month later, peace no longer felt like a trick my body would be punished for believing. Lily slept through the night with her rabbit tucked beneath her chin, and woke asking ordinary questions about spelling tests, pancakes, and whether Papa D could come to school assembly day. Damien showed up for those ordinary things with the same seriousness he once reserved for danger. He tied Lily's scarf when she forgot, checked the weather before her rides to St. Brigid, and listened to every story she told at dinner as if second-grade drama mattered. Somewhere in steadiness, I changed. By then, the estate felt less like refuge and more like a carefully built version of family. Miles had become the kind of presence that arrived with tea, dry humor, and exactly the right amount of silence. Lily trusted him, trusted the house, trusted tomorrow. I envied that. I was slower. I noticed the way Damien waited outside Lily's bedroom until she fell asleep, the way he never interrupted my routines with her, the way he gave me room to disagree. Love did not arrive dramatically. It accumulated in those permissions, those acts of care that expected nothing in return. That morning, I asked Damien to meet me in his study after Lily left for school. The room had become a map of every truth we had survived, but sunlight made it gentler than I remembered. He knew from my face that this would not be a conversation I could avoid. I told him one truth first. I loved him. Saying it to myself felt less frightening than I expected because it had been true for weeks. Then I told him the truth. Love was not enough for a child or a future if safety depended on secrets and fear. He listened without interrupting, and that alone told me how seriously he was taking me. There was no charm, no reassurance, no attempt to kiss the problem quiet. He said he had begun shifting parts of his business away from the shadows. Restaurants, logistics, real estate, holdings that could survive daylight. Other interests would take longer. Some ties were old, some obligations to cut all at once, but the process had started before I found courage to name my conditions. That mattered. It meant he was not changing to win an argument. He was changing because he wanted a life. I told him what yes would require from me. Transparency. A timeline. No vague promises about someday. Lily deserved a childhood she could explain without lowering her voice at school. She deserved friends, field trips, school plays, knees, sleepovers, and a father figure who did not arrive wrapped in menace. I could accept discreet protection. I could not accept a house run like a warning. And I needed a line drawn with honesty. No more blood is the answer. I understood what he had done for us. I was alive because of it. But I would not raise Lily inside reflex. That last condition was the one that made him go still. He did not argue that violence had kept us alive. We both knew that. Instead, he admitted, with a seriousness that felt intimate than flirtation, that it would be the hardest habit to unlearn. His world rewarded speed and finality. Mercy was slower. Law was unreliable. But then he looked toward the hall where Lily's things waited for morning, and something in him softened. He wanted to become the man she believed she had found. Not a safer lie. A truer one. That was the time hope sounded disciplined. He came around the desk then, slowly enough that I could have stepped back if I needed to. I didn't. The proposal was not dramatic. No ring lifted into light, no rehearsed speech, no performance. It was simply the truth placed between us. He wanted me, Lily, and the life forming around us permanently. He wanted marriage not as shelter, not as possession, but as choice. He wanted mornings, school conferences, fights, holidays, and the privilege of being held to the promises I had demanded. I said yes the only way I could, with conditions intact and my eyes open. We did not pretend a decision would clean the past in an afternoon. By the time I left the study, we had spoken about lawyers, accountants, schools, security, succession, disclosures, and the mechanics of moving from one life into another without pretending consequences vanished. It felt less like fantasy than a contract built from tenderness and accountability. That was what let me trust it. He was not asking me to close my eyes. He was asking me to keep them open beside him. 6 months later, with that transition underway, I stood at a new chapter and recognized peace there. The woman who had run through rain into Luz Verde would not have believed this version of me. She would have called her reckless, weak, compromised by gratitude and desire. But I knew better now. Real safety was not purity. It was truth, boundaries, and a love strong enough to change shape under daylight. Damien and I had not solved everything. We had chosen to solve it in the open. That difference meant everything. By spring, a chapel date sat quietly on the calendar. Lily practiced carrying flowers, and our dangerous story was learning to become tender at last, too. 6 months later, I stood in a small chapel on the north side of Chicago, with Lily beside me, and sunlight sliding through colored glass across the floor. My dress was simple, ivory, and quiet in the best way. Lily wore pale pink and held her flowers with both hands like the job mattered more than anything on earth. Miles sat in the front pew with the look of a man pretending not to be emotional and failing at it beautifully. I remember thinking how strange it was that peace could feel this solid after beginning in rain and fear. I was not the woman who had run into Luz Verde soaked to the bone and ashamed of being seen. I was still tender in places. I still checked locks twice. I still woke sometimes expecting the past to be standing in a doorway, but I no longer apologized for taking up space in my own life. I knew what danger looked like now. I knew what love looked like too. It looked less like intensity and more like steadiness. It looked like truth offered in daylight. It looked like a child who no longer flinched when a man entered the room. Damien was waiting at the altar in a dark suit that fit him like his old life had once fit him, except his face had changed. The sharpness was still there, the authority, the sense that a room noticed him before it understood him. But he felt lighter, more open, less like the city had loaned him to us, and more like he had chosen to stay. When I reached him, I did not feel rescued. I felt met. That mattered more than I can explain, because rescue can become debt. Meeting is where partnership begins. The ceremony itself was short and almost modest, which was exactly why it felt true. I did not need spectacle. I needed witness. Lily standing near us with all the solemn joy in her little face was witness. Miles dabbing at his eye and pretending he had allergies was witness. Damien holding my hands like they were not fragile things, but chosen things was witness. By the time the vows were done, I felt something settle inside me that had been restless for years. Not fantasy, not escape. Home, built carefully, with both eyes open. That afternoon, when the chapel had emptied and the last flowers were being carried out, Damien and I slipped into a quiet room off the hall just to breathe. The silence between us felt full, not empty. I told him the doctor had confirmed what I had started to suspect a few days earlier. There was a baby. His stillness broke in the gentlest way I had ever seen. Gratitude moved across his face first, then disbelief, then a kind of reverence that made me understand how deeply this man had changed. Fear no longer ruled our future. When we told Lily later that evening, joy lit her from the inside out. She started planning immediately, naming colors, possible toys, the songs she would sing, and whether babies liked rabbits as much as she did. Damien listened to every wild detail with damp eyes and a smile he did not bother hiding. Watching them together, I understood the miracle was not the pregnancy by itself. It was that new life no longer felt like another thing to protect from terror. It felt like an invitation into a future we had earned, one honest choice at a time. Now I know red flags matter, even when loneliness begs you to ignore them. Safety is more than surviving the worst night of your life. Love is not proven by intensity, but by who stays, tells the truth, protects your peace, and changes when it matters. If this story touched you, like, share, and tell me why in comments today.